Hello, my name is Christine, and I am going to be talking to you today about how to do high altitude science experiments, exploring near space with your students. I have been teaching high school for about 14 years. I'm currently now teaching middle school, and I'm pursuing my PhD in astronomy education at UC Santa Barbara. I also teach astronomy at College of the Canyons. My contact information is right at the bottom of the screen, churst@heartdistrict.org. And my website, where you can find all of these curricular resources, including this presentation, the slide deck, my student videos, and all assignments associated with this project can be found at hurstscience.com. Again, here is that website. So, have you ever wanted to place real, authentic, and meaningful science learning experiences in the hands of students? I don't think you'll find many science teachers that are going to say no to that question. That's what we all want to be able to do. And I think that with NGSS, we have this opportunity to be able to really do that because that's what NGSS is really pushing us to do. It's really unfortunate that districts and curricular companies see NGSS as just another cookie cutter way to just check a box. But I have found that through transferring the reins of learning to students and letting them really design these experiences. And I'm not talking about super high level students either. I'm talking about like students that were on the verge of dropping out. Those are the ones where I see the largest gains. And this has been such a transformative experience to be able to transfer that learning and all autonomy and agency to students. It's been transformative for them, and it's been transformative for me as a professional. So I used to teach earth science before NGSS really got rid of that. And one of the things that I loved to teach was air pressure. And maybe you found this too. Maybe you've taught 8th grade science, or maybe you're teaching physics and you've taught about air pressure. There's so many cool demos. But what I found is that students found this so incredibly boring because this was not something that they could relate to. It was not something they could conceptualize. And somehow, even with all the demos, with the exploding or the crushed cans and the balloons, they just still had a tough time being able to conceptualize this. So I really dive into this concept of exploring the atmosphere by first looking at this property. So the objective here is, how can you model air and how do you know it's actually there? And again, on my website, I have a whole set of experiments in labs for you when you're back to face-to-face teaching. But before we begin, I have groups discuss whether air actually takes up space. And I have students model this with a syringe. So I'm sure many of you guys have seen this video before. So I asked students, what did you observe? And I always give students sentence frames. I find that sentence frames are something that help all students. This may be something that's remedial, but even with honor students and seniors in high school, sentence frames just really help to frame their thoughts and to direct their line of thinking if that's what I'm looking for. So if you haven't seen this video, it's pretty smart.
760. Gewonnen hat Herr Dr.
A lot of science there that we talk about. So then I give students this picture, which you could do digitally as well. You could absolutely take this and they could do this in Google Drawings or Google Docs, and you could put this directly into Google Classroom. I give them this picture of the tank engine before, during, and after, and they have to think about how they're going to model air and what caption they would give that. So they have to make a model describing what happened to the rail car, to the air inside and the air outside. And they have to compare then how some students drew air and how other students drew air, and look at the validity of each of those models. And they have to use that model of the air to describe what caused the rail car to be crushed. And this would work with honestly any level of student. So they're both visualizing it and then captioning verbally. So then what I have students do, or what I would have you do if you were in one of my workshops, is to think about where the air was in each of the images. How did they model that? How does that compare to others? And which model they think is most effective at identifying that change. And what we generally see is some students model air with circles and others model it with arrows. And it's interesting to see the strengths of each model and why students chose those and to make those comparisons. And I make them like cover up their drawing so no one else can see it. So then they compare and they end up being pretty different. And how the heck does that relate to your content? So regardless of what NGSS course or what science course you are going to be teaching, every single content area includes something related to air, to atmosphere, to climate, and to weather. If you are teaching Living Earth, you have to teach a whole segment 6, on climate change, which is focusing on movement in the atmosphere, making predictions and looking at evidence for motion in the atmosphere, both historically and presently. If you are teaching chemistry, you are looking at evaluating information from the oceans and ocean acidification to be able to justify what is happening in the atmosphere. And if you are teaching physics, you are going to be looking at those quantitative components in terms of being able to identify pressure and the forces at work. So any subject, and if you are doing 7th or 8th, those all fall into those as well. If you're teaching any subject doing high altitude balloon experiments, checks the boxes of your standards. Additionally, these capture every single science and engineering practice. So those concepts then directly relate to what I have students do. Here is an example of launch day.
I don't know. Longer than.
All right, are you ready? All right, guys, let's get a 3, 2, 1. On 3, 2, 1.
This is the culmination of weeks worth of experimental design. Payload train. So students have to take these conceptions and concepts of air pressure and investigations of what the atmosphere is composed of, how it changes, and what properties it has, to be able to design an experiment to go to near space on a high altitude balloon. So what the heck is it? High altitude balloons were the very first tools used during World War II to be able to capture images of Earth. These were used prior to sounding rockets to be able to sample components of the atmosphere, to be able to get pressure readings, temperature, altitude, density. So all of our initial investigations of the atmosphere were done aboard high altitude balloons. These gave us the very first picture of the curvature of Earth, proving that Earth is not flat. Fun fact, I was contacted by a French journalist who's like the French Anderson Cooper. His name is Martin Weil, W-E-I-L-L. Martin Weil Worldwide is his show. And my students, after they launched in 2019, a week before my wedding, were featured in a launch to disprove flat Earth. It was quite fun to be a part of. I had a group of students, all girls, all who went on to be aerospace majors, that got to participate in that. You could look up Martin Weil Worldwide Flat Earth and you could find us. So the US Weather Service launches 2 weather balloons a day from almost 100 different locations in the US and nearly 900 locations globally. Twice a day, these are launched and have been for years. So what I have students do is design experiments that are then flown to 60,000 to 100,000 feet, so approximately 19 miles upwards in the stratosphere, to be able to expose these experiments to near space conditions and make predictions about what those changes will be and quantify them after they get them back. So I always have multiple experiments that are flown. In print, I have that I've flown 13. I've actually flown 17. I don't put that in print because I might have been over the mass limit that year. So specifically, these balloons can go to about 19 miles or 100,000 feet into space. They carry payloads, cameras, sensors, anything else we want to put aboard. They expand throughout their trip and they burst when the air pressure at the upper atmosphere is less than 1% of when it was launched. They then fall back at free fall velocity or nearly free fall velocity for the majority of the trip, at which point the parachute, which is right here, opens when it has enough atmospheric drag to be able to catch and slow that fall to approximately 7 meters per second from free fall velocity. So you can clearly see, just based on the trajectory of the flight, the ascent, and the descent, how much science students can analyze, and they get back all of that data. They're actually able, depending on what you send up, to see it in real time. My students have been able to see when we've had a really slow launch or when we've had a really fast launch. There was one time it reached 103,000 feet in 43 minutes, which was crazy fast. It did not have very much horizontal motion, just a ton of vertical. And other times, the roughest landing we had was it ascended so slowly, it took 4 hours to reach burst. And it was in the mountains of Tehachapi, and I had to have the fire department help me retrieve it. So we can see here the layout of the payload train. This is approximately 30 feet from the neck of the balloon to the parachute, which is the most expensive part. This one I had a tracking device with an antenna that pointed down to Earth. I no longer need to use that. And I have 2 payload boxes and a GPS. So here I have likely far more equipment than you would need to do this yourself. So anyone that teaches any kids that is interested in real authentic learning and interested in taking a risk professionally should be interested in doing something like this. This is truly project-based learning where the kids completely design, engineer, and own the experience. Their goal is to get experiments up into space and retrieve them. What they do with that is entirely up to them. This meets every single NGSS standard, every DCI, every cross-cutting concept, every engineering practice. So there isn't one that you could find there that we have not touched on. This also highlights every Common Core anchor standard of speaking, listening, and mathematical practice, because students then have to analyze their data and present it. And again, what you do with that is entirely up to you. I've had students that have presented in a community forum where they had to attract media. We've invited Bill Nye, he's yet to come, but we have had students that have presented this in a scientific conference format, where we had NASA mission directors come to be judges, and they presented this in a conference style symposium. And these are 15, 16-year-olds that are doing that. This equips students with real world problem solving skills and the organizational and communication skills that they need to enter the real world. Most importantly, it allows students to fail. They have to be disappointed. They have to work through when things don't go their way, and they have to figure it out. They can't just Google an answer. There isn't an easy solution a lot of times, and I don't have all the answers, because depending on what their experiments are, there can be 7 experiments running at once, and only they can figure it out and troubleshoot it. And I've seen students that have failed every single class that have been more invested in this than anything they've ever done. They're accountable to each other, they're accountable to the project, not just to me. And it's something they can really tangibly take hold of. Students entirely direct the evolution of this project and this process. So I've had students that have sent up every variety of experiment, and you don't even have to do this. There are a lot of people that do this sort of project, and all they do is they send up some sensors, and they just bring it back and have students learn about the atmosphere and atmospheric conditions through the analysis of those sensors, looking at the velocity, looking at the altitude, looking at the air pressure, looking at the temperatures. A lot of science that can be done. I choose to take this a step further and have students decide on some predictions and design a research question and go through the entire process of experimental design, in addition to learning about the components of the atmosphere. What you do with that is entirely based on your time that you have to do this. If you only have a class or 2 or 3, you may want to just do sensors. If you can commit to doing this for a few weeks, send experiments. You will never look back and decide that was the wrong call to do. I've had students send up every variety of plant and food, so much so that I no longer allow students to do that unless they can seriously make the case for it. Food becomes very difficult to quantify based on the change and the cause and effect, and it always ends up resulting in a very subjective qualitative test at the conclusion, usually resulting in me having to eat it. And I've eaten some very disgusting space things. In that documentary, I was talking about we actually had Martin, who was the journalist. He had to eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and they don't eat that in France, apparently. He thought it was quite disgusting. It might have been on the outside of the box, and it really was gross. So I no longer allow students to do food unless they can really make the case for it. I highly recommend you don't do eggs. It ends up being extremely messy. So I do have to call it sometimes. I did have, this is an example of a brainstorm board that students did. What ended up winning here was the ice cream. These students created a whole mechanism to see if the turbulence of the flight would be enough to create ice cream. They put in all of the ingredients, they researched all of the ingredients to see how they would behave in extremely low pressures and temperatures. There was a ton of science that went into that. They measured the motion within it. They had a Geiger counter, they had a temperature sensor within and outside of their mechanism. It was really, really cool. We have sent up many insects. I tell students that if it is big enough for them to get attached to, it's probably unethical. I have sent up a mouse. I did send up, well, students sent up a very large scorpion. That one I would not recommend. We will never do that again. Geiger counters, there's just so many different cause and effect things that you can do. I'm going to show you in a second sound in space. We've actually done that twice. When all else fails and experiments fail, they can always do an image analysis, a cloud analysis, or even looking at the topography of a landscape below them. I did have one student whose experiment failed. He lost all of his data, and he looked at the imagery and discovered that there was a lake in Southern California, close to where we live, that was not on any maps, that would that had been depleted due to an illegal well. And he learned all about the policies surrounding land use in the area 10 miles from our school and water use by finding this lake that shouldn't have been there, and that seasonally appeared and disappeared. It was really interesting. I have cosmic dust collection here with some stars by it, because that's really the experiment that started this whole thing. I started getting into this because students asked if they would be able to collect cosmic dust, if it was possible to collect cosmic dust from a high altitude balloon. We had just been to JPL. They had just seen a sample of aerogel. They had just met Bill Nye, totally coincidence. He just happened to be there when our field trip was there. And we sent up a mechanism, and I'm going to show you a picture of that, to collect cosmic dust. So it has been accumulating at the edge of the atmosphere for 4.5 billion years, and NASA had a Stardust mission to attempt to collect this, and we tried to replicate that. So one of the other things that students have to do every year is they have to create a documentary of this project. And every year I challenge them to then make a mini documentary that we use as a trailer. And this is one that was created a few years back.
Students of West Ranch High School's 2015 astronomy course are preparing for one of their biggest challenges of the year. For several months, they have studied the many facets of our ever-expanding universe, from the creation of stars and star clusters to the destruction of planets and galaxies. Now they will get to experience the kind of studies astronomers conduct as they orchestrate one of their biggest projects of the year. As each team collects their data from their experiments, they can move forward with the new skills and experiences that can only be gained from a project like this.
Listen. You heard there was a slight pitch change. What I loved about that is that song that played. If you happen to be in Southern California, maybe you visited the Griffith Park Observatory. There's an amazing planetarium show, which has that as the opening and closing song. And it's very nostalgic. And I was talking to the class about how I love that song. And it's just very nostalgic for me. We went to the planetarium, and the student that made this video that really was behind the media team here, he told me that, I mean, obviously I knew that they were doing that experiment, but he never told me what song they were going to be using for their experiment. He told me the whole time it was a surprise. So I didn't know which experiment they chose until I saw that video. And he had contacted the composer of that song. He did a serious amount of research and networking, contacted that composer, and got permission to use it. And then that was like a surprise for me at the end of the project. It was amazing. So just an amazing example of the sort of ingenuity that students have to do in order to really think out of the box in something like this. I've had students that have reached out to industry professionals. They've gotten access to Class 1000 clean rooms entirely on their own. They have had to utilize resources like social media to find grad students who have done similar research. In particular, there was one which involved a mouse that I told them they could only do that experiment if they found that someone else had done it and they don't repeat those mistakes. They instantly found a student at a university in Southern California that had replicated that experiment to learn from those mistakes. It was amazing. And they might have made some others, but they didn't make the initial ones. So I want to give you some examples of some research projects that students have done and sent up. Now, again, the objective here is the process, the experimental design. Whether or not it was a great project or not is not necessarily the objective. So I put students into groups, and they all have a launch role. And in those launch roles and groups, they also have to design an experiment. So this one had to do with pennies. So their research question was, how do pennies corrode differently in space than on the ground? So they measured the corrosion, and they learned how to identify, and they learned all about the process of producing pennies and when pennies change composition and coating. So they separated pennies into those groups based on the year and the material used to coat the penny. So they hypothesized that perhaps the mass of the pennies would change. So this is something that I was pretty sure about, but they had to learn it. So then they used different materials to clean the pennies before and afterwards. So here were their control pennies before, so 3 groupings based on the year. Here were their results and analysis. So they had their pre-experiment group and then their post-experiment group. So the mass of the objects was obviously unaffected. The vinegar's effect on the zinc and the copper they looked at, and the differences between the acidic and the basic solutions. Their result was entirely inconclusive, and they did not get any evidence to support their various hypotheses, and that happens. Here was a second sound experiment we did, and this one was really interesting. So this student I had in 2019, and he had to reach out to the student in that previous video that had conducted that frequency experiment. That previous student had looked at the change in pitch and frequency of an entire song. So this group looked at just variations of the note C, and they called it their frequency experiment. So their background research, they were looking at sound waves. And their research question was, what will happen to the frequency and decibel level of sound as altitude increases? So first they had to look at what is frequency. They had to do some research, and I took snapshots of each of their research presentations. So these are all pictures from theirs. Of course, there was a fire. So their hypothesis was that the frequency of sound will get lower as the altitude increased. Here was their setup. This is a payload box. This is their speaker that was right next to something recording. When we found it, I was able to actually hear it. So that one is actually so low, it's inaudible. So the result was the frequency did not get lower as the altitude increased. So this is the recording from the balloon. They ran it through their analyzer. So they had viola C. They had middle C, treble C, high C, double high C, and triple high C. And you can see comparatively how each of those change from ground to space. So they then looked at the decibel change, the clarity, and then they made conclusions. So their conclusion was that their original hypothesis, the frequency and volume of sound would get lower as altitude increases. That was incorrect. The frequency did not change. However, the volume did. So those are just a couple of quick examples. So every year I have students that have to put together this entire experimental proposal and design their research. Then they present their research. So those are just some snippets of some research presentations. So how I structured groups, I put groups into various roles, and then in those roles they came up with their experiment. So the groups that I put students into were launch, payload design, media PR, and recon. And then I had students that within each of those groups, they applied to be the team leader. And then I had a role called mission control, which was the ultimate student leader that ran the entire thing. I am really just more of a guide on the side. And again, this is for high school. So would be a bit more structured if, and I may not have a mission control with the responsibilities that I gave mission control if this were middle school, but giving one student to make them that person. And a couple times I've done 2 or 3 people in that role, but I have students actually apply for these. And in every case, the students who have been mission control have just blossomed and grown from that experience and gone on and really taken that leadership experience. So again, I have leaders in each of these groups. So the students in those groups report to the leaders report to mission control. So you really have to think about the maturity level in order to do those. And the way I decide on how I'm going to group them is I split them according to, number 1, their interest, and 2 is their self-assessed leadership style. And I use 2 chapters called from this book called How NASA Builds Teams. And in doing that, I have students self-assess a badge color. They're either green, yellow, blue, or orange, based on how they make decisions. And these chapters are pretty interesting. They're easy reading. They give examples that NASA has had in big, with very large monetary ramifications, such as Hubble and such as the Mars Polar Lander, in which groups were not put together in a balanced manner. And they had very large, well-publicized, big budget disasters. So I have students read through that. They have to then self-assess. There's a whole quiz that they go through to assess their color, and I make the groups very balanced. What we tend to see is that students that have, or adults that have, that are more of your typical engineering, linear analytical thinkers are your blue and your orange. But we need people that are the green and the yellow, that are the ones that carry a project. And in that reading, they find that groups were entirely blue or orange, and without the green and yellow, they completely broke down because they didn't have people that bridged the communication between people that were actually doing the tasks. So I take a bit of time and put them together based on being a logical decider and emotional decider, because they have to have all of them together. So this is a little example of a 4-dimensional leadership, and I use this as the model then for student groups. So I try and balance it between each of those colors. And in a science class, especially an elective science class, the green and the yellow are harder to come by, but they're absolutely essential in each group. One of the things that is one of the greatest components of this is students' ability to solve problems. Because they come up, they are many, and life is not immune to this. Too many times we send students out into the world graduating high school, and they have never dealt with failure. And for some students, that is the toughest thing about this, is dealing with that.
Join me in a final countdown.
What happened with the first launch is, since there was a lot of wind, the pressure monitor gauging how much helium we are supposed to put in the balloon, it gave us a false number. So we let it go, and it didn't go anywhere because the buoyancy was equivalent to the normal air pressure. So we had to pull the balloon back down, unsecure the zip ties and electrical tape, and then reinsert the helium tube and fill it back up with more helium so that it could lift off of the ground.
Every class period, I was learning something new, whether it was about leadership, problem solving, or just communicating and working in groups in general.
This is launch day with students running the whole thing. So one of the things that was so challenging about that particular day was that those students were launching in front of their friends and their peers during their lunch hour. And when that balloon didn't go up, instantly their phones were going off saying, oh, hashtag the launch that wasn't. and their peers were brutal and unforgiving. And these students had to just get over it and deal with it and solve the problem. They had the news there. Then I had my vice principal tapping me on the shoulder going, lunch is almost over, you need to hurry up. It was a ton of pressure, and the students had to deal with it. They had to figure out what was wrong. They had to problem solve. I had to make sure that I could cut all of the duct tape and electrical tape off of the neck of the balloon and not pop it. That was stressful. So here is an example of payload boxes with experiments. Going back to, I had mentioned the cosmic dust collection. This is a mechanism the students 3D printed. We reached out to our community college. I was not teaching there at the time. This was my first year. And they had a tech department that had a 3D printer. And I reached out to them and I said, hey, if students design something, can you print it? So students entirely designed this. They then coded a Raspberry Pi breadboard to open given a certain time. They did the math to determine at what time after launch it would be at a certain altitude and at what time it would be at that altitude on the fall back down. So we had to release this thing at a specific time because it would be contaminated with the atmospheric dust that was on the ground. It could not get things like nitrogen in it. It had to be above the layer of the nitrogen in the atmosphere, or it would contaminate it. We'd never know if it was successful. So they had to code that. Unfortunately, this was our first year and it landed in Pasadena on a barbecue and it opened. So when we found it, we had no way of knowing because it had been contaminated with ground level atmospheric particulates. But the process was pretty amazing because this was so beyond what I could do to engineer that, and the students did it entirely. So here are some images of launch day. This is the best photo I think ever taken. This is an upward looking GoPro, and this is the exact moment of burst. And still so much science that can be looked at there, from the color of the sky, which is not blue, which is indicative of where this is and above most of the atmosphere, to the symmetry in which the balloon has burst. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes I get it back and there's just one hole in the side. So I think this one just looks so amazing. And the stability of the atmosphere up here, and that the sun doesn't have a bunch of trails after it or look like it's really obscured because it's so high up. This one burst at, I believe, 93,000 feet. So here are some images of students as they are out recovering the balloon. They all want to be in this group. I'm very particular about how I choose students to be selected here because I generally rely on chaperones to take these students out.
The problem was that the GPS wasn't working properly, so we actually weren't able to find the balloon on our own. We had to use assistance from Mrs. Hurst and our teacher, and she had to call the company to get the GPS to work. And once we solved that issue, we knew that we could go forward, and once we had our real launch, the GPS wouldn't be a problem, and we'd be able to actually go find the payload once it landed.
Oh my god, bro, that is just so crazy. It's right there. It's right.
Guys, why is that payload train not assembled?
They have to wear gloves to protect the balloon from that.
It's gonna be an hour still, though, isn't it?
If you guys figure that out, then yes, you will have to turn these on at the very last minute. So you will have to, like...
My favorite part of the high altitude balloon launch had to be cutting into the payload box. That was so much fun to do with Shay.
Okay, wait, the most important part.
Oh yeah.
Lego ballerina pink
back, man. The instructions are it has to come back.
Okay, seal that. Seal this. You need to seal this. All
I'd have to say my favorite part is definitely the process of discovery. In no other class and with no other experiment have I been able to go through, ask a question, and deliver an experiment on that question without there being a predetermined answer that the teacher already knew.
I'm going to stop it right there because what that student said was so powerful when I saw this video, because students are in charge of all of the interviews and putting this together. So I didn't see that until they were in their research symposium when we premiered this video. And that was so powerful because that was a student that she's an artist. She's an art major. It was all I could do to get her earbuds out of her ear the entire year. She was very unengaged. And I initially put her in I think I put her in media because I knew she was very artistic and I knew she would want to be involved in the writing of our press releases, in recruiting media, and in being in charge of putting together this final product of the documentary. But my payload design team, that was the ones that were designing and configuring what actually went inside the box, what went where. They had to actually put the layout, design the layout of the box, align the sensors and the experiments. They were just struggling with being able to fit things in and basically the Tetris of it all. And I realized they needed someone with an artist's mind. I put her in, and that team had been stuck for 4 days. They could not move forward. They were holding up everyone's experiments because they could not configure how the box needed to go. She immediately saw it, and her whole rest of the year was so transformed by that because they needed her. They needed her eye, they needed her mind. And they ended up sending up a mouse to space. She is a devout vegetarian. The mouse came back and it was dead. And the only way to figure out how it died was to dissect it. And she was the one that did it. She had to learn how to dissect and she had to do it. And it was awesome. It had to be done and she did it. And that was so cool to see.
From the high-altitude balloon launch, I've learned that teamwork is all about the effort that an individual puts in. It can be hard during times of conflict, but communication is what saves the team overall.
The sound of the installation is loud.
I learned so many new things such as leadership skills and learning to work with others under difficult circumstances. The independence and freedom that we were given to make mistakes and learn from them, as well as collaborate with both classes, was my favorite part.
Cover the balloon, and one of the teams has been calculating the trajectory, how to calculate the lift based on our overall balloon mass, and you can follow the mission live. We hope you all enjoy, and we should have liftoff here in about 10 minutes or under. Thank you guys so much.
So here are some pictures of students at work. Now I no longer need to use this archaic software called Microsoft Map Point, but I used to. So here are students putting together that payload box. Here's an aerial image of our school. Here is an outward-facing GoPro, and they can start to see a little bit of curvature, a lot of topography features there, topographical features. We can really see the features of Southern California, the atmospheric conditions. Here we can see those again. We can see the grapevine. Getting up higher still, we can start to see a layer of ionization. Here we can really determine some cloud patterns as students are getting higher in the atmosphere and above the top layer of clouds in the troposphere. And we can see that blue layer of ionization. This is our very first year. This was captured on a student's GoPro because I did not have my own at the time. There was a fire in San Diego at the time. We can still see some of that smoke. I love that picture. Here was our cover photo from 2015. This was 1980s Lego guy that was released to space. The GoPro happened to capture it. And here I love seeing that layer and the blackness of space. So what you would need at the bare minimum, you definitely need a balloon and you need helium. You need a way to track it and get it back. You need some sort of payload box. You can even use an igloo cooler. You need something to harness it together, but that can even be twine or fishing line, and you need a parachute. A parachute can be the most expensive. Those are reusable. Everything else is not necessarily reusable. Some sensors you can get. You could configure an Arduino with all of these things. You can configure it to have altitude, temperature, humidity, pressure. Those allow for the greatest degree of cause and effect analysis. And a Geiger counter is always really neat too, especially if you launch around the same time each year, like I have done, and students comparing the cosmic radiation counts each year. That's really interesting. For tracking, there are a few different options. I put this one first because that is what I prefer and what I would recommend is a ham radio. That is also the cheapest way to go, but it does require a license. And if you have that, you get all of this sensor data in real time. That is less interactive for people to follow because they have to go to the ham radio site or the app, but it's definitely doable because I love having people follow in real time. I do not recommend a spot radio because I have had this fail on me multiple times. The last time I nearly lost a payload. I only didn't because the ham radio came in about 12 hours later and told me where this thing was. But I have had way too many failures of spot radios. I know that is generally the standard for people doing this, but I will never use them again. After my last launch, someone contacted me and said they had done a launch and done multiple launches with a GPS dog collar that worked better than anything else. I found one of those on Amazon. It was about 30 bucks. So apparently that's an option too. There are some kits out there. There is Stratastar that sells these pre-made. It is very expensive, but the benefit of Stratastar is you see, you have a Twitter handle and people can follow along. They can add their photos to your social page. Anyone following anywhere in the world can see all your data, the trajectories, everything, but it is expensive. There are some finicky issues with that. High Altitude Science sells everything you need to be able to put it together. There's many ways to DIY. There is another company called Magnitude.io, which sells a really cool sensor kit to go up aboard these. But High Altitude Science and Stratastar are really the two to look for to get things like the balloons and all of that logistical things. FAA rules. These are FAA exempt as long as you are under a certain mass. So generally it's 6 pounds below the balloon. You can plan on 6 pounds above the balloon, so 12 pounds total. You're not supposed to send up cell phones, but apparently you can now if the airplane mode is enabled. That is a do at your own risk if you want to risk a phone. So I have students think about what would they send to space, and these are the constraints: is protecting the equipment, protecting and securing their experiments, containing all of the components, predicting, tracking, and retrieving, thinking about the constraints of mass, getting PR there, and attracting media. And I always like to do this in as minimal boxes as possible. If I have 2 classes, I give each class a payload box. So here you can see a picture on the outside. They embedded their camera. Here are some sensors and experiments. So to start this project off, I give students these question starters to think about what they want to study. And again, all students benefit from question starters. And I want to get them just thinking about relationships, of correlations, of causation, to make predictions about when things are exposed to space, to look for changes, to get them thinking about what things could be different in space than on the ground. Some years I'll have kids that come in, they instantly know what they want to do. And sometimes they really struggle with deciding something that is valid. Sometimes they just want to do a banana peel and they have to think about, okay, what can I investigate? What change can I look for in that banana peel? And yes, we've sent banana peels. So if you were here with me, I would have you come up with 3 testable research questions that would be something that you could or your students could reasonably do aboard a balloon? And again, this is largely based on the time constraints that you have. Do you have only a matter of days, or do you have potentially a couple of months? And I know that the first response is going to be, oh, I couldn't possibly do it in a couple months. But I challenge you to think about the impact that if you can deviate from your standardized curriculum for a couple of weeks, the value that this will have and the impact it will have on all of you, your students and yourself. So I get students to think about how they can measure or quantify their experiments. So how the heck can they answer their research question? If they have, and I want them to think about the differences between quantitative and qualitative research. And this is something that in a normal classroom environment, we want students to know, but it isn't really until they are actually using it and embodying the process of being a scientist that they understand this, because it's their experiment, it's their data. They have to have a way to give a quantity to what it is they're measuring. So things like taste, sound, texture, visual observations, qualitative explanations, they have to give a quantity to. So a lot of times they have to come up with a rating scale, creating standards for how they would rate that property or that quality. They have to specifically define what each rate would be, have multiple people assess, because we want this to be repeatable, just like science is. So ultimately, my goal for them is to be able to understand what goes into the scientific process, because they are embodying it. So they always have to have a ground truth to be able to say with confidence that there has been a change, and they have to eliminate variables. So this is where the real value is, because every pod, every group of a few students is doing something different. So students need to think about what the heck it is they're going to do, what factors they're testing from their research question. And they have to learn the difference between a research question and a hypothesis. And we go through this entire process of designing. So the culmination is launch day, but there's so much that goes into that. And again, even if you don't do experiments, it could just be looking at the sensor data in order to investigate the atmosphere. But if you have the time and you have the will to be able to allow students to be able to experiment and to question and to fail and to give them that autonomy, I am telling you, you will never regret that. You will see so much measurable change in your students, in your classroom, the way you approach teaching, and you as a professional. And I can't encourage you enough to just take a step and take a risk and be able to do that. You'll never regret it. It has completely changed me as a professional. Please make sure you check out my website. That complete video that you've seen some snippets of is there. Again, that is hurstscience.com. And you can go to high altitude ballooning and see all of my curricular resources. Please take them. You can find my student videos. You can see a video of me trying to recover the last balloon. That's kind of funny. I had to go out with a machete on my mountain bike. And if you wanted to do this, you can take all of my curriculum and just take it and go and learn through this process. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions. And I would love to hear that this is something that you are putting into practice. Here again is my website. Have a wonderful day.